What is tragedy? At the end of the last video, I suggested that tragedy typically asks us to focus on the problem of agency, including the question of whether characters have or do not have free will. And in this third video in the series, I shall be looking at some aspects of that particular problem. The first aspect of this question, which we're going to consider, is the relationship between the individual and their society. Because the freedom of the individual tragic character is often constrained by their role in the social sphere. Expectations are placed upon them by other people, and it is often the case that the tragic character may internalize those expectations as if they were their own, even when they conflict with deeply held values and desires. Let's look at three examples from very different plays. First of all, Aeschylus's Agamemnon. Agamemnon, the Greek king and leader of the Greek army, is planning an expedition against Troy because the Trojan prince Paris has abducted or eloped with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, who is Agamemnon's brother. The brothers therefore are determined to get Helen back. The Greek fleet is assembled at Aulis, but cannot sail in the direction of Troy because the winds are against them. Agamemnon is told that the winds will only change if he makes a sacrifice to the goddess Artemis, the sacrificial victim being his own daughter Iphigenia. Now, the reasons why he would not want to sacrifice his own daughter are obvious. So let's look at the arguments on the other side. As the leader of the Greek army, he is responsible for that army's success. He would lose face if he were to back down. As Menelaus's brother, he is responsible for Menelaus's honor. Menelaus would be dishonored if he and Agamemnon simply allowed Helen to be abducted. We can see then that grave expectations are placed on Agamemnon, creating this terrible dilemma which he faces. I shall say more about that in the video devoted to Agamemnon. Let's look then at Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and the character of Brutus. Brutus is urged by his friend Cassius to act against Julius Caesar to prevent him from becoming a king, in effect a tyrant. There are many good reasons why Brutus should do that, including to preserve the liberty of Rome. In so doing, he would in effect be replicating the role of his ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus, who led the move to expel the Tarquins from Rome after Tarquin had raped Lucrece. Lucius Junius Brutus is an example of someone who makes a heroic stand in defense of liberty. Brutus is being urged to do the same. So there are in effect two kinds of pressure on Brutus. Pressure exerted by Roman values. What it means to be a Roman is in part to defend freedom. And pressure exerted from the past, the pressure to live up to his own ancestry. Thirdly, we have the example from Racine's Berenice of the Roman Emperor Titus in love with Berenice, the Jewish queen. And Titus is in a sense trapped by expectations as to how a Roman emperor should act in relation to marriage. It's felt that marriage to a Jewish queen would not be acceptable to the Roman people. But rather like Brutus, Titus is also trapped in a sense by his own family past, trapped by the expectations created by his own father about how Titus should behave. In all three cases, the individual struggles to act because the pressures on them, the social and ideological pressures, are so strong. More difficult to understand, and certainly for the writers of these plays, more difficult to map with any degree of precision, is the way in which individual human agency is constrained by the actions of some supernatural power, and almost by definition, that supernatural power will be beyond our full understanding. In the Greek tragedies, we often see that individual named, identifiable gods intervene in the action, sometimes through their oracles, sometimes by actually appearing on stage themselves, as happens, for example, at the end of Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia. But it also happens that from time to time, characters in Greek tragedy suspect the intervention of a supernatural power which they cannot identify. And this is often referred to as a daimon. It's a word from which we get the English word demon, but in Greek there is no suggestion of an evil character to it. It is simply an unnamed, indeed often unnameable, supernatural power. A lot of Greek tragedy includes speeches and choruses in which the characters worry anxiously about how they are to relate to the gods, what the gods demand. There are even anxious questions about how the gods should properly be addressed. Human beings seem to be trembling on the threshold of the divine. In addition to these named and unnameable gods in Greek tragedy, there is the idea of fate, the idea that human life is determined by a pre-existing fate. And for the Greeks, in fact, fate, or the fates, because they were often personified as three female figures, drawing out, spinning, and then cutting off the thread of life. For the Greeks, fate or the fates were even superior to the gods themselves. We also come across the concept of fortune. That was a Greek idea which was developed more strongly by the Romans and is very often encountered in Renaissance drama. Fortune is sometimes personified as a figure who is spinning a wheel. Characters sit at the top of Fortune's wheel and are then hurled down. Fortune is unpredictable and amoral. Fortune hands out good things to human beings and arbitrarily snatches them away. Although fate and fortune are not compatible with Christian thinking, these two ideas are often found in Renaissance drama, which inhabits a Christian framework. And this allows Renaissance dramatists to create a tension, a degree of uncertainty in the minds of the characters and the audience as to exactly what kind of supernatural framework is around and determining perhaps the lives of the characters. And so we can think of tragedy as being very often a liminal drama. The word liminal means taking place on the threshold. It comes from the Latin word limen, a threshold. And tragedy often places the protagonist in a liminal position, that is to say, on the threshold between the human world and the supernatural world, whatever it is that lies beyond the human, for which every culture has its own different vocabulary. And it is often difficult to interpret, indeed it is often one of the sources of tragedy, difficult to interpret what happens at this threshold. We can see that, for example, in Macbeth with the weird sisters. They don't quite seem to be human, but nor are they obviously supernatural. They seem to have knowledge that other people do not have, but we don't know where this knowledge comes from. So neither their status, human or supernatural, nor the nature of their knowledge and their speech can be readily clarified, and tragedy often therefore exploits this radical uncertainty about the relationship between the human and whatever it is that lies beyond that threshold. And in Greek tragedy in particular, it is often difficult to know the will of the gods, because that will may be expressed through prophecy or through oracles, and often the language used is ambiguous. Another way in which the freedom of individuals in tragedy may be constrained is their relationship to time. Because in tragedy, the present is often constrained by the past. Indeed, it is also often the case that the future is radically uncertain. The past may not truly be past. It's often the case that the past is not over and done with. And so, in a sense, the present is haunted by the past. Sometimes, of course, there are literal hauntings by ghosts, but even when that doesn't happen, there's often a strong sense that characters are weighed down by the past, and that restricts their room for manoeuvre in the present. It may be that characters have to cope with the consequences of what they themselves have done. An action, in that sense, may not be over and done with, wrapped up and put away. Its consequences permeate through the action. But it's also the case, in many respects, that other people's actions constrain the freedom of tragic protagonists. Let's look at some examples. Orestes, in Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, inherits an obligation. He inherits the obligation to avenge the murder of his father. And the murderer of his father is Orestes' own mother. So we can see immediately how a terrible moral dilemma, a terrible burden, is placed on the shoulders of Orestes as a result of what someone else has done in the past. A very similar scenario haunts Hamlet, when he is told by the ghost of his father that King Hamlet has been murdered by his own brother. Hamlet, like Orestes, is presented with an obligation to right the wrongs of the past. As for Oedipus, his tragedy is partly that he has killed his father and married his mother, but it is also his discovery that that is what he has done. So it's his recognition of the true nature of the past that forms the tragedy of Oedipus in the present. He can't escape from his past. He is forced to recognize its true character. And then we might also think about the example of Lady Macbeth. She doesn't actually kill King Duncan, but she helps to plot the murder and to cover it up. Towards the end of Shakespeare's play, there's a haunting scene in which Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking. She is trying to wipe the blood of King Duncan off her hands. Now, of course, literally there is no blood on her hands. The murder happened a long time ago. But her state of mind is such that she seems to be still inhabiting that present moment. The moment of the death of Duncan is not past and over and done with. It lives again very strongly in the present tense of her own guilty imagination. And so we have seen that there are several respects in which the tragic protagonist may not be free, and tragedy as a genre seems characteristically to direct our attention over and over again to the question of autonomy, of agency, of free will. Are we free to act? Tragedy maps the pressures on the individual that come from society, from what the gods require, from the past and the burdens that a character may inherit. These are all ways in which tragedy explores the limitations to an individual's autonomy. And that word autonomy comes from the Greek, meaning literally self-law. And tragedy asks us, are characters truly a law unto themselves? And more seriously, if they try to be, does that attempt bring about their downfall? This leads us finally to think briefly about two important terms in the Greek moral vocabulary. These are terms which offer us a key to the shape of many tragic plots. The words are hubris and nemesis, and they're words that have lodged in the English language. Hubris, for the Greeks, meant pride, but not just any kind of pride. It is more specifically excessive pride in one's own abilities and ideas, excessive to the point that it becomes offensive to the gods because it goes beyond the proper limits of the human. It takes credit for skills and actions and achievements that should properly be accorded to the gods. Hubris, therefore, overreaching. And in Greek thinking, hubris is inevitably followed by nemesis. Nemesis is divine retribution for hubris. And in many tragedies, there is this sense that retribution may be waiting for the tragic protagonist, though the form that it will take is often concealed from view until the last minute.